Imagine commanding the largest empire the world had ever seen, with cities bending to your name, armies marching at your signal, and kings treating you like destiny itself. Now imagine that, even with all that power, you still cannot sleep, because the greatest danger is no longer outside your walls, but inside your own circle. This is where the final year of Alexander the Great begins, not in triumph, but in tension. Most stories about Alexander are told like legends: a young conqueror, a fearless general, a man blessed by the gods. But legends rarely talk about what happens when the war ends and the mind has nowhere left to run. In his last year, Alexander was not simply expanding territory. He was battling something far more complex: the weight of absolute power, the fear of betrayal, and the silent collapse of the identity he built through conquest. Before we continue, subscribe to Stories of Human Minds right now, because if you're fascinated by the psychology of great leaders, hidden ambition, and the dark side of human greatness, you're going to want the next stories we publish. Your support helps the channel grow, and it tells the algorithm that you want more narratives like this. By the time Alexander reaches this final phase, he is only in his early 30s, but his life already feels like several lifetimes. From Macedonia to Egypt, from Persia to the edges of India, his name has moved faster than any messenger, and his reputation has become larger than any living person. Yet the truth is that expansion creates a problem no one prepares for. Every victory produces new enemies, and every new land adds another layer of risk. In the beginning, Alexander's army followed him with devotion because he was the man who always won. He ate with them, marched with them, suffered with them, and made them feel like they were building something eternal. But time changes even the most loyal hearts. Years of blood, years of distance from home, years of endless marching under foreign skies begin to erode the spirit. And when the soldier's belief starts to weaken, the leader starts to feel it before anyone speaks it out loud. Alexander had conquered the world, but now he needed to hold it, shape it, and control the future of an empire that had grown too large to be governed by one man's will. This is where paranoia begins to grow, not as madness, but as strategy that slowly turns poisonous. Because when a ruler reaches the top, every friendship becomes suspicious, every general becomes a potential rival, and every silence becomes a threat. He was surrounded by men who owed their status to him, yet he also knew those men commanded armies of their own. He had created greatness in others, and now he had to wonder what that greatness might demand. The mind starts to do dangerous math. If I can take an empire, why couldn't they take mine? And in that calculation, trust becomes a luxury. Alexander's final year is not just about what happens to his body, but what happens to his certainty. The warrior who once moved with clear purpose now begins to move with pressure, grief, suspicion, and a hunger to push forward even when the ground beneath him is cracking. And the more he tries to control everything, the more fragile his world becomes. Because in the last year of Alexander's life, the empire is not the only thing expanding. So is the fear, so is the loneliness, so is the realization that power can become a cage. And soon, the greatest conqueror in history will face a battlefield he cannot outmarch. The fear was already there, quietly growing in the background, but Alexander did what he had always done when uncertainty appeared. He moved forward, not because it was the safest choice, but because stopping would force him to confront a truth he had avoided for years, that his empire was built on motion, and if the motion ended, the cracks would become impossible to ignore. When his campaign reached India, it was not just another frontier. It was the edge of the known world, the point where maps became myths and where ambition started to become obsession. Alexander had spent his entire adult life proving that there was no boundary strong enough to stop him. Every time the world said enough, he treated it as an insult. Yet in India, for the first time, it was not an enemy army that confronted him. It was his own exhausted men. They had followed him across deserts and mountains, through storms and starvation, through cities that surrendered and cities that burned. They had watched friends die in battles that felt endless. They had lived in lands where the language sounded like noise, where the sky seemed unfamiliar, and where home was not a destination but a memory. Many of them had become rich, yes, and many of them had gained status, but none of that mattered when their bodies were breaking and their minds were worn down. And then came the moment that every conqueror fears, but almost no one talks about. The army refused, not in secret whispers, but in open resistance. At the Hyphasis River, after years of marching east, the Macedonians finally reached their limit. They did not want more glory, more battles, or more distance from everything they loved. They wanted to live. They wanted to return. They wanted an ending that was not written in blood. For Alexander, this was more than disobedience. It was an identity crisis, because his authority was not only political, it was psychological. He had trained these men to believe in him, to believe in his destiny, to believe that his victories were proof that the gods were on his side. But when they stopped believing, even for a moment, it created a dangerous question. If the army can refuse him here, what else can they refuse later? He tried everything. He used persuasion, reminding them of what they had achieved. He used pride, making them feel shame for wanting to stop. He used silence, withdrawing into his tent like a wounded lion, hoping guilt would pull them back into obedience. But none of it worked. The wall he had always broken through was not made of stone this time. It was made of exhaustion. And when Alexander finally agreed to turn back, he did not do it with peace in his heart. He did it with humiliation, not humiliation in the eyes of the world, but humiliation in his private mind, the kind that turns into rage and then into suspicion. Because if the empire was built by his will, and the will could be challenged, then the empire was more fragile than it appeared. The return from India was not a victory march. It was a slow retreat disguised as strategy. The further west they moved, the more Alexander seemed determined to prove that he was still in control, as if control was something he could force into existence. He staged sacrifices. He demanded ceremonies. He acted with the stiff posture of a man trying to convince everyone, including himself, that nothing had changed, but everything had changed. His soldiers no longer saw him as the unstoppable hero of their youth. They saw him as a man pushing them past human limits. And Alexander, who had once understood loyalty like a language, started to treat hesitation like betrayal. When trust weakens, even slightly, the mind begins to search for reasons, and those reasons become darker with every mile. Because the truth is, Alexander did not simply turn back after India. He returned with a wound that could not be healed with gold or conquest. A wound inside his certainty. And in the final year of his life, that wound would shape every decision he made as he tried to rebuild the aura of invincibility, even while his world was quietly slipping out of his hands. After India, Alexander still needed to prove something, not to the world, but to himself. If the army had refused him at the edge of the unknown, then he would show them that turning back did not mean weakness. He would show them that he was still the man who could force reality to obey him. And so the journey west became more than a return. It became a test of endurance, a punishment disguised as purpose, and the beginning of a year that would slowly drain the life out of the legend. Instead of choosing the safest route, Alexander led part of his forces through the Gedrosian Desert, one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. It was a decision that still makes historians debate his motives, because on paper it looks irrational. The terrain was brutal, the water scarce, the heat deadly, and the distance unforgiving. But Alexander was not thinking like a normal commander anymore. He was thinking like a man whose identity depended on doing what others considered impossible. Some say it was strategy, a way to match the route taken by Cyrus the Great in the past, proving that Alexander could surpass even the most famous kings of Persia. Others say it was a desire to discipline the army, to remind them that they did not decide the limits of the campaign. And some believe it was pride mixed with fury, because deep down he could not accept that his men had forced him to turn back. Whatever the reason, the outcome was devastating. The desert did not care about ambition. It did not care about rank, titles, or the dreams of empire. In Gedrosia, soldiers died without battle, animals collapsed without arrows, and supplies vanished into the sand. Thirst became a constant torment, and hunger turned discipline into desperation. The sun was not just hot, it was oppressive, like a force pressing down on every thought, every breath, every step forward. And this is the part people rarely focus on when they speak about Alexander. They talk about brilliant tactics and glorious victories, but they forget that leadership is also judged by the suffering it creates. In the desert, Alexander's greatness became harder to admire because the cost was no longer paid in enemy blood, but in the lives of his own men. These were soldiers who had marched with him for years, men who had already given everything, and now they were dying because their king needed to feel untouchable again. Alexander tried to share their suffering, and it mattered, at least at first. He walked with them. He refused water when they had none. There is even a famous story where water was brought to him in a helmet, and he poured it out, refusing to drink while others were dying of thirst. Whether every detail is perfectly true or not, the story itself reveals something important. Alexander understood symbolism. He knew the empire was held together not just by force, but by belief. But belief can only survive so much pain. When people lose brothers, friends, and years of their life, they stop caring about symbols. They start caring about survival. And in the Gedrosian desert, the army's relationship with Alexander shifted again, moving from devotion into silent resentment. They still followed him because they had to, but inside, the emotional bond was weakening. This is how collapse begins, not as a sudden explosion, but as a slow draining of trust. The desert did not kill Alexander's empire directly, but it damaged the thing that protected him more than any armor: loyalty. It turned his army from believers into survivors. And it pushed Alexander further into isolation, because the more they suffered, the less he could admit the suffering was his fault. When they finally emerged from Gedrosia, they were not simply returning to the empire, they were returning with trauma, with bitterness, with a new understanding that Alexander's ambition could destroy them even without an enemy. And the man who once looked unstoppable now looked dangerous, not only to Persia or India, but to his own people. From that point on, Alexander would try to rebuild control through grander plans, stricter authority, and deeper emotional intensity. But the damage had already been done. And as they approached Babylon, the center of his future vision, the question was no longer whether Alexander could conquer more land, but whether he could hold together the minds and hearts of the people who had carried him this far. When Alexander finally returned from the desert, the empire did not greet him with peace, because peace was never the point. He had not marched across the world just to sit still and enjoy what he had built. Rest felt like decay to him, and stability felt like surrender. The moment he reached Babylon, he began acting like a man who believed his story could only survive if it kept expanding, even if the people inside that story were already running out of strength. Babylon was not just another city. It was a symbol of empire itself, a place where the ancient world gathered in one breath, where wealth, religion, language, and politics collided. To Alexander, Babylon looked like the perfect capital for a new world order. He did not want a Macedonian empire that simply ruled Persia. He wanted a merged civilization, a giant system that could outlive him, a unified world where cultures were blended under his authority. And in his mind, that vision required more than victory. It required transformation. So he began rebuilding, but not in the comforting way people imagine. This was rebuilding through control, through big plans, through constant movement, Alexander reorganized provinces, appointed officials, demanded reports, and monitored the loyalty of commanders who had grown powerful during the long campaigns. He pushed administration like a man trying to outrun the possibility of collapse, because deep down, he knew that empires can be taken apart, not only by enemies, but by disunity inside the ruling circle. He also began preparing for something even larger: new expeditions. Instead of slowing down, he started talking about Arabia, about new trade routes, new fleets, new frontiers. A massive shipbuilding project began, and Babylon turned into a logistical machine. Ports were improved, resources gathered, sailors recruited, and plans drawn as if the world was an empty map waiting for his pen. To his closest allies, Alexander sounded inspired. To his exhausted army, he sounded relentless. This is the psychological trap of extreme power. When a ruler becomes the Great One, he can no longer behave like a normal person without feeling like he's betraying his own identity. Alexander had become addicted to conquest, not just as action, but as proof of who he was. The moment he stopped conquering, he would have to face the emptiness left behind. He would have to live with his losses. He would have to admit that his limits were human. But Babylon also brought another problem, one that slowly poisoned his ability to feel safe. Because Babylon was full of people who did not share the simple loyalty of Macedonian soldiers. It was crowded with Persian nobles, local officials, foreign ambassadors, merchants, priests, and political networks that existed long before Alexander arrived. And in that environment, suspicion becomes logical, because every smile can hide calculation, every gift can carry a message, and every celebration can be a performance. So Alexander tightened his grip. He demanded unity. He demanded recognition. He demanded a kind of respect that went beyond military obedience and entered the territory of worship. He continued pushing Persian customs within his court, including forms of ceremony that made his Macedonian companions uncomfortable. To Alexander, these rituals were strategy, a way to fuse cultures and stabilize rule. To many of his men, it felt like betrayal of their identity, like their king was turning into the very type of ruler they once despised. And the tension grew, quietly and steadily. You could feel it in the distance between the king and his veterans. You could feel it in the nervous politeness of officers who were no longer sure which words were safe. You could feel it in the whispers that Alexander no longer trusted the men who had marched beside him since the beginning, because power had changed the social air around him. Every success had elevated him higher, and that height created isolation. The higher he climbed, the fewer people could speak honestly. And when honesty disappears, paranoia grows in its place. The mind starts to create threats to explain discomfort, because it is easier to imagine enemies than to admit internal weakness. Alexander was rebuilding an empire, but he was also rebuilding himself, trying to turn pain into purpose and doubt into domination. Babylon became his stage, a place where he could demonstrate control through vision, wealth, ceremony, and future plans. Yet underneath it all, the emotional foundation was unstable. And soon, that instability would stop being subtle. Because in order to maintain the illusion of absolute power, Alexander would begin to treat hesitation as disloyalty and doubt as rebellion, setting the stage for a darker phase of his final year, where trust would become rare and fear would become a tool. The more Alexander tried to tighten control, the more his world began to feel like a room full of hidden knives. Babylon looked magnificent on the surface, but inside the palace, inside the meetings, inside the quiet moments after celebrations, something was shifting. Power was no longer just a crown on his head. It was a pressure inside his chest. And the deeper that pressure grew, the more Alexander's mind started to interpret the world through suspicion. When a leader rules through conquest, loyalty is simple at first. Men follow because they believe in victory, because they want reward, because the enemy is clear. But once the enemy disappears and the empire becomes permanent, the true threat becomes internal. Rivalries among generals, political games among nobles, ambitions that cannot be seen on a battlefield. Alexander understood this, and he feared it more than any Persian army. By this stage, his companions were no longer just friends. They were powerful figures with their own networks and influence. Some of them had governed provinces for years, building personal wealth and local loyalty. Some had grown used to acting without being watched. Some had begun imagining what the empire might look like after Alexander. And in a system built around one man's vision, even the thought of after can feel like treason. So Alexander began to act differently. He demanded tighter discipline. He watched faces during conversations. He interpreted hesitation as resistance. He punished disrespect, not like a soldier correcting a soldier, but like a ruler defending a sacred image. The smallest signs became meaningful to him. A private meeting, a delayed report, a whisper behind closed doors. In Alexander's mind, these were not neutral events. They were warnings. This is how paranoia works at the top. It does not begin as madness. It begins as a survival instinct that slowly becomes exaggerated. And once it takes hold, it reshapes reality. The mind stops asking, is there truly a threat? And starts asking, who is hiding it? The difference is everything, because the first question allows calm. The second question creates fear and aggression. Purges began to take form, not as chaotic violence, but as calculated removals. When accusations appeared, Alexander reacted with a speed that revealed how ready he was to believe the worst. Some officials were executed for corruption, others for disloyalty, others for suspected conspiracy. To outsiders, these actions could look like necessary governance, the cleaning of an empire. But to those inside his circle, it looked like a new rule. The closer you are to power, the more dangerous life becomes. At the same time, Alexander's public identity became more demanding. He continued to push ceremonies that elevated him above ordinary kings, expecting gestures of respect that many Macedonians found humiliating. The tension was no longer hidden. It was present in banquets, in military gatherings, in the way the old veterans looked at the newer court figures. A split was forming inside the empire's soul, between those who wanted Alexander to remain a Macedonian commander and those who accepted or even encouraged his transformation into something closer to a divine monarch. And Alexander could feel this split. He could feel it in the lack of warmth, in the stiffness of responses, in the way his words landed with less enthusiasm than before. The scariest part for a man like him was not rebellion itself, but losing the emotional authority that made rebellion unthinkable. So he pushed harder, and that pressure created more resistance, and that resistance made him push even harder. In moments like this, the palace becomes a mirror of the ruler's inner state. If the ruler is anxious, the court becomes anxious. If the ruler distrusts, everyone begins to watch everyone. And soon the empire is not held together by shared belief, but by fear of being the next target. Alexander still spoke of grand plans. He still spoke of new conquests. He still stood as if he were carved from certainty. But behind the posture was something new. A man who could no longer relax. A man who needed control the way others need air. And as paranoia became part of his strategy, it also became part of his personality, shaping every relationship and every decision. Because now, Alexander wasn't only fighting the problem of ruling a massive empire, he was fighting the frightening possibility that his closest bonds could turn against him. And soon, one loss would strike him so deeply that it would tear open everything he had been trying to contain, pushing his mind into an emotional collapse that no amount of power could prevent. For all his suspicion, for all his control, Alexander still had one person who made the world feel less dangerous. One bond that didn't feel like politics. One presence that reminded him of the early years when the empire was smaller, the dreams were simpler, and loyalty still felt pure. That person was Hephaestion. Hephaestion was not just a friend in the casual sense. He was Alexander's closest companion, the man who understood him without long explanations, the one who could speak honestly when others stayed silent, the one who had shared the full weight of the journey. When Alexander looked at Hephaestion, he didn't see a rival or a general with his own agenda. He saw trust. He saw the last safe corner of his world. And then, in the final year, that corner collapsed. Hephaestion fell ill and died, likely in Ecbatana, and in that moment Alexander lost something more valuable than any territory. People often describe it as grief, but that word is too small for what happened. This was grief mixed with psychological dependence, because Hephaestion was not only a friend, he was a stabilizer. He was the emotional anchor holding Alexander's mind together while everything around him became heavier. When the anchor disappeared, Alexander's reaction was not balanced or restrained. It was extreme, it was explosive, it was the response of a man whose internal structure had been hit at its weakest point. He refused to accept the loss. He raged. He wept openly. He stopped acting like the untouchable king and became something raw and human. And that humanity terrified the people around him because it showed how fragile the great conqueror truly was. Alexander punished the physician who failed to save Hephaestion, not just as a political act, but as emotional revenge against reality itself. He ordered massive mourning rituals, turning personal grief into public theater. He demanded that the empire mourn with him, as if collective mourning could rebuild what was gone. In many ways, this was not about honoring Hephaestion. It was about Alexander trying to force the world to acknowledge the size of the wound. He cut hair. He held ceremonies. He filled the city with displays of loss. It was as if he wanted grief to be visible everywhere, because if grief became the atmosphere, then he would not have to feel alone inside it. But grief does something dangerous when it mixes with power. It can turn into obsession. It can turn into irrational decisions, masked as devotion. Alexander began planning a heroic funeral for Hephaestion on a scale that looked almost unreal, spending enormous amounts of resources and time. The message was clear. Hephaestion was not a normal man, therefore Alexander's pain was not normal either. His loss was declared imperial, sacred, and historic. Yet beneath the grandeur, another truth was forming, quiet but deadly. Without Hephaestion, Alexander's paranoia had no counterbalance. The one person who could calm him, challenge him, soften him, was gone. And now every voice around him sounded less trustworthy, because none of them carried the emotional legitimacy Hephaestion had earned. This is where the mind begins to change, because intense grief doesn't just cause sadness. It rewires priorities. It makes the present unbearable. It makes the future feel pointless unless it offers distraction. And for Alexander, distraction meant movement, more projects, more plans, more ambition, anything to avoid sitting with the emptiness. His court watched him closely because they could sense it. His energy was still intense, but it was different. It had a sharper edge. His decisions carried more emotional force. His patience became thinner. His desire for control became more desperate. And as he pushed forward again, he was no longer driven purely by vision, but by a wound that wouldn't close. When Hephaestion died, Alexander didn't just lose a friend. He lost part of his own identity, the part that still remembered who he was before power became heavy. And in the months that followed, the conqueror began to move like a man running from grief, even as grief quietly poisoned the foundations of his empire. Because now he was heading toward Babylon again, with new plans and a mind that was no longer protected by trust. And that combination, unstoppable ambition and emotional collapse, would lead directly into the final days, where the greatest ruler alive would begin to fade in a way no one expected. After Hephaestion's death, Alexander moved like a man trying to outrun his own mind. He spoke of future campaigns as if conquest could replace what grief had taken. as if a larger empire could somehow fill the space where trust once lived. But every step forward carried an invisible cost, because he was no longer leading with the calm confidence of earlier years. He was leading with intensity, with emotional exhaustion, and with a hunger for control that was beginning to look like desperation. When Alexander returned toward Babylon, the city felt less like a capital and more like a stage where the final act was waiting. Babylon was the heart of his plans, the place where fleets could be built, where new routes could be designed, where the next great expedition could begin. But it was also a place filled with shadows, politics, and warning signs. And Alexander was now the type of man who noticed every shadow. There were omens, stories of bad signs, uneasy interpretations from priests and advisors, and warnings that the city carried danger. In earlier years, Alexander might have brushed such talk aside. But in this last phase, his mind was different. Grief had made him more sensitive, more reactive, and less patient with uncertainty. The idea of fate was no longer distant philosophy. It felt personal, as if the world itself was leaning in, waiting to take something else from him. Inside Babylon, the atmosphere around Alexander grew heavier. The court watched him, and he watched them back. He was still the king, still the commander, still the figure whose name could move armies. Yet something had changed in the way he carried himself. The emotional softness that Hephaestion brought out in him was gone. The sense of balance was gone. And when balance disappears from a ruler's mind, the entire empire begins to feel it, because every decision becomes sharper and every mistake becomes more dangerous. Then came the illness. It did not start like a dramatic fall. It started like discomfort, a fever, a weakness that could be explained away as fatigue. Alexander had been pushing himself for years through war, travel, alcohol, and stress that would destroy most men. The body can endure incredible punishment, but it keeps a record, and sooner or later, the record must be paid. Alexander was 32, yet his body carried the scars of a lifetime spent living at maximum intensity. Different accounts describe different triggers. Some mention a banquet, heavy drinking, and sudden pain. Others speak of fever slowly rising over days. But what matters is how quickly the unstoppable man began to lose control of his own body. The king who could command continents now struggled to command his own strength. As the days passed, the sickness tightened its grip. His fever climbed, his energy faded, his speech weakened, and the court began to enter a state of panic, because Alexander was not just a ruler, he was the empire's glue. There was no clear successor that everyone accepted. There was no stable system ready to function without him. The empire was built around one human center, and now that center was fading. And when the center fades, everyone begins to calculate. Generals began thinking not about the next campaign, but about survival. Courtiers began watching each other more than they watched the king. Loyalty, which had already been weakened by exhaustion and paranoia, now transformed into quiet positioning. Who would control the army? Who would control Babylon? Who would control Alexander's body if he died? The empire was still standing, but the emotional structure holding it together was already breaking. Alexander, meanwhile, seemed to drift in and out of awareness. Each day brought less strength. Each movement became slower. The silence around his bed grew louder, because when people cannot control events, they watch them, and the watching becomes fear. And then something haunting happened. Alexander stopped speaking. The court begged for words, for direction, for any clear sign of the future. The army outside demanded to see him, terrified that rumors might spread faster than truth. Alexander was brought where the soldiers could look at him, and they passed by in lines, staring at the man they once believed was immortal. Some wept, some reached toward him. Some could barely accept what they were seeing, because it felt impossible. The conqueror who crossed the world was now trapped inside a dying body, unable to rise, unable to command, unable even to explain the meaning of what was happening. And the more silent he became, the louder the empire's fear became, because silence invites interpretation, and interpretation invites conflict. By the time Alexander's strength was nearly gone, the question was no longer whether he would recover. The question was, what would happen the moment he could no longer hold the empire together with his presence alone? And somewhere in the palace, as the fever burned and the court waited, the future was already being decided by men who were no longer thinking like followers but like successors. The moment Alexander's voice disappeared, the empire began to speak for itself, and what it said was fear. Fear dressed as loyalty, fear disguised as concern, fear hidden behind polite faces and controlled ceremonies. Because everyone understood the same terrifying truth. Alexander was not just a king sitting on a throne, he was the system itself. And if the system lost its center, everything around it would begin to fall apart. In those final days, Babylon did not feel like the capital of a stable empire. It felt like a locked room where every person was quietly measuring the distance to power. The generals, who once lived as brothers, now stood like rivals. The commanders, who once obeyed without hesitation, now watched each other as carefully as they watched the king. It was as if Alexander's illness had exposed what had been building underneath for years. The hidden competition, the silent ambition, the reality that conquest creates winners who eventually want to win again, even if the target becomes each other. The atmosphere grew tense. With every hour, Alexander remained silent. Messengers moved through the palace like nervous shadows. Decisions that once would have been made in minutes were delayed because no one knew who had the authority to speak for him. And that uncertainty is poison, because uncertainty creates space, and space invites conflict. Even if no one declared it openly, the empire had already entered its most dangerous stage, the stage where power exists, but control does not. As Alexander weakened, people began asking the question they were afraid to say out loud. Who comes next? It sounds simple, but for an empire built on one man's aura, succession is not a detail. It is life or death. Alexander had no clear adult heir ready to rule, and the men around him were too powerful, too proud, and too suspicious to simply agree on one solution. Every possible successor created enemies, and every delay increased tension. At some point, Alexander was asked who should inherit his empire. Ancient sources describe him giving an answer that would echo like a curse: to the strongest. Whether those were his exact words, or whether the meaning was shaped by those who survived him, the message fit perfectly with the tragedy of his life. Alexander had conquered the world through strength, and in the end, he left the world he built to be fought over by strength. And that is where the collapse truly begins, even before he officially dies. Because the collapse of an empire does not start when the king's body stops breathing. It starts when people stop believing the future will be peaceful. It starts when the strongest men in the room stop thinking like guardians and start thinking like owners. It starts when loyalty turns into strategy, when friendship turns into positioning. When the question becomes not, how do we protect what he built, but what part of it can I take? The final hours of Alexander's life were filled with this tension. He lay there, the most powerful man on earth, surrounded by the machinery of empire, yet unable to control what he had created. And there is something haunting about that, not because it is rare, but because it is human. Power can conquer cities, but it cannot conquer time. It cannot conquer the limits of the body. It cannot stop the hunger of other ambitious minds waiting for their moment. Even Alexander's presence could not prevent the transformation taking place in Babylon. The empire around him was already shifting into a new shape, one that did not need him. And in that shift, you can almost hear history preparing its next violence, because empires do not dissolve gently. They break, they split, they bleed. So even if Alexander was still alive, the psychological truth was already clear. The empire was beginning to outlive the man, and that is always the moment when the dream turns dangerous. Because after the visionary disappears, what remains is not the vision, but the struggle for control over its remains. And as the palace held its breath, waiting for the final moment, the world outside Babylon had no idea that a storm was already forming. A storm that would tear the empire apart from the inside and turn Alexander's greatest achievement into a battlefield without end. If you want more stories that explore the hidden psychology behind history and power, subscribe to Stories of Human Minds now and leave a comment as well, because it helps the channel reach more people and keeps these narratives alive for the next episode.